Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Rose. It's an honor and a privilege to actually be here for bringing on Rosh Chodesh Shevat. And just the entire concept that this takes place every single Rosh Chodesh is actually inspirational in its own right. And to be able to participate and hopefully share in the chizuk is a tremendous schus. And it brings to mind actually something that we were bringing about this past Shabbos. A story, an anecdote that took place the last week of Tevis, Tavshin Memches, when the first shlichus, the group of Chassidim, Shluchim, and Askanim were traveling to Russia at the start of trying to retrieve the Sfarim that are still in captivity in Russia. Amongst them was Rabbi Kunin, the head shliach here in California, and Rabbi Nissen Mendel, one of the Rebbe's secretaries, was part of that first group. Rabbi Levin, the Rebbe's librarian. And before they left, it was the last week of Tevis, Tashim Memches, they had a semi-yechidus with the Rebbe in Gan Eden HaTachten, outside of the Rebbe's door. And the Rebbe spoke to them, and the Rebbe gave them brachas. And then the Rebbe had them wait for a moment, and he went back into his room, and he brought out from his room what's called the Alei Hagah, the sheets of a mimer that was going to be released in honor of Chavdal Tevis that week, that the Rebbe just finished editing, and they just printed a copy of the galleys for the Rebbe. So this was, I guess, like a sheet that was larger than a regular sheet. It had four pages on each large sheet. And the Rebbe brought these out from his room, and the Rebbe gave one sheet of the galley to each one of the members of the group that were there at the time in Gan Eden HaTachten. And it was, the actual mimer wasn't yet printed in a formal kuntras for them to be able to learn that way, but the Rebbe gave it to them in this manner. Each individual got one sheet. And the Rebbe said to them, Af zu lernen der mimer, weln ihr dafen onkommen einem zum zweiten. In order to be able to learn this mimer, you're going to have to rely one on each other, because each one of you only have a part of the mimer. So in order for you to learn it in completion, you're going to need each other. And I think that this concept, especially when it comes to the area of chinuch, is such a powerful idea that the only way that we can truly be matzliach in the field of chinuch is really by being misached, by learning one from another, by being mechazik one another. This really gives us that ability to be able to forge ahead in an area that can be fraught with many challenges and difficulties, and being there for one another, Fargrengen, in the manner that's taking place here, is certainly a manifestation of Afzu lernen der Maimer, that der onkommen einem zum zweiten, so that we strengthen each other and we grow Mechayel el Chayel in this manner. So it's, like I said, it's a tremendous schus. I think that we can build a little bit on what Mrs. Landa was bringing about the long-term implications of our leadership as it relates to the idea of Yud Shvat, and the Rebbe's vision for his Chassidim. Everybody knows the famous statement that Jonathan Sachs has made, and it's become this standard line of how he's met many leaders, and most leaders may have followers, but the Rebbe is a leader who created leaders. And this is something which is not a davar Chodesh by us, but certainly in the realm of chinuch, this is the case. And the Rebbe expressed this quite clearly in the Fargrengen of Yud Shvat Tovshin Chav Gimel, where the Rebbe speaks about the idea that we say after the passing of a tzaddik, and in the case of the Frierdiker Rebbe, we say, Ma zari b'chayim, af hu b'chayim. Because his offspring are alive, so too the tzaddik is alive. And the Rebbe asks the question that there are so many ways to express this idea that someone's children are alive or their offspring are alive. You could say, Ma banav b'chayim, af hu b'chayim. You could say, Ma yotzei chalotzav b'chayim, af hu b'chayim. Or in the case of a Rebbe, and in the case of Shevat, in the case of the Frierdiker Rebbe, you could say, Ma talmidov b'chayim, af hu b'chayim. Ma chasidov b'chayim, af hu b'chayim. Why is the Lashon that we use, and in particularly about the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe says, Ma zarei b'chayim. And the Rebbe says that what is important that we need to focus on is that when Yaakov Avinu, and in the case of a Rebbe, that's the Nasi b'Yisrael, Nitzutzoi shel Yaakov Avinu, when they have Talmidim, and they establish them, and they guide them, it is actually important that it's in a manner of zarai. The word zarai is miloshen zera, a seed, a planting, a sapling. The way that the Rebbe expects a student of his to conduct himself is not that, oh, I'm a student of a Rebbe and therefore I am going to, on my own, learn. I am on my own going to conduct myself in a manner that's appropriate, but rather just like when someone plants a seed. It's not so that one more seed should come forth from that. There's no need to plant a seed for only one more seed. But the purpose of planting a seed is so that a eitz pri, oise pri limineu, should grow forth from that, which leads to hundreds of other seeds coming forth from that original seed that was planted. And that is how the Frierdiker Rebbe, and by extension the Rebbe, view the investment that they invest in their Talmidim and Chassidim. That it's not sufficient for that individual to be a gute feine shene yid or a wonderful Rebbitzin on their own, but rather that they should be in a manner of zaroi, that they are going to take care of implanting the ideals and the teachings and the guidance of the Rebbe and share that with others, share that in particular, the Rebbe says in that Fargrengen, with Talmidim, particularly with Talmidos. And the Rebbe points out that we see that the Frierdiker Rebbe, in his own Nesius, over the course of his lifetime, involved himself in Chinuch al Taharas HaKodesh on every level. From Chinuch that was for adults, to Chinuch for Bachrim in the yeshiva when he served as the Menahel of Temchet Mimim, to ensuring the teaching of Aleph Bais to those who didn't even know Aleph Bais. But the purpose, says the Rebbe there in the Sikha, of him even teaching Aleph Bais or ensuring the teaching of Aleph Bais to the child was not just that that child should know Aleph Bais, but so that that Aleph Bais child should then ultimately be a eitz pri oise pri limineu. And that is the schus that we have, that we serve in a very overt and a very direct manner as that extension and that type of hashpah that we have on our Talmidim and Talmidos is literally a manifestation of ma zarei b'chayim, afu b'chayim. When the hashpah is in this manner, that's when we say that the nasi is b'chayim. So when it comes to our education, it's important to look at the guidance that we have from the Rebbeim, obviously, on how that education takes root, and to look at their leadership and to apply that into what it is that we need to be doing in our classrooms, in our surroundings. So what's interesting is that I quoted from a Fargrengen of Shevat Tashon Chav Gimel, but a short time prior to that, 2 weeks earlier, in during the week of Parsha Shmos, the Rebbe shared what it means or what it takes to actually have an effect, how to be a leader who is going to have a true effect on those that they're caring for. And the Rebbe points out that it says in the pasuk in Parsha Shmos, Moshe Hayaroya, that Moshe was a shepherd, and the Medrash has two explanations about the Moshe Hayaroya. One point the Medrash says is that Moshe was born. He was a born leader. He was a born shepherd. That's what the Medrash says on the words of Moshe Hayaroya. The other Medrash is more well known, and that's the Medrash that says how the Eibishter tests the Roya Yisrael, and in order to see if they're going to be good leaders, he tests them with being shepherds. And the Rebbe questions the first Medrash and says, if Moshe Rabbeinu was a born leader, if he had that quality, why was it necessary then for him ultimately to actually be a shepherd? Why did he have to get stuck being a shepherd, and not just for a short period of time? It says in the Medrash Tanchuma that Moshe was a shepherd by Yisrael for 40 years. So for 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu, an individual who represents the highest levels of Nevuah, the highest levels of Chachma, had to go and deal with the sheep for 40 years. Why was that necessary? And the Rebbe explains it based upon an interesting statement from the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov says that the sheep of Yisrael actually had within them some of the netzutzos, some of the sparks of the neshamas of those Yidden that were going to be in the Midbar with Moshe Rabbeinu for 40 years. And that's why it was necessary for Moshe Rabbeinu to be a shepherd specifically of Yisrael's sheep, and specifically for 40 years, because in order for a leader to take care of the spiritual needs of his flock, he first must take care of their physical needs. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu, for 40 years, was taking care of the physical needs of these Shepselach, so that he should be able to then be the Raya Mehemna in the Midbar, who would give the Yidden the Torah and sustain their Amunah and do everything else it is spiritually that we know was the Tafkid of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rebbe points out that this is something that we find to have been the case by many leaders, starting with the Baal Shem Tov, that we know that the Baal Shem Tov and his Chaverim, some of the Tzaddikim Nestorim in his time, got together to specifically, in the Hatamim, there's a whole arichas there of how the Baal Shem Tov did this, but they got together specifically in order to take care of the physical needs of Yidden who were suffering physically in that period of time in Eastern Europe. And it was only, says the Rebbe, once the Baal Shem Tov took care of physical needs of Yidden, that he then rose and revealed himself to take care of the spiritual needs of Klal Yisrael. Similarly, the Alter Rebbe, as soon as he got married, what did the Alter Rebbe do with his dowry? He went ahead and he took the Nadan that his Shver gave him, and he established the Gemilas Chesed, the Gemach, in order to help support Yungalite that didn't have Parnasa. And once that was the case, that the Alter Rebbe was taking care of the physical needs of Klal Yisrael, only then afterwards did he go on to becoming the Alter Rebbe, who wrote the Tanya, the Shulchan Aruch, and took care of the spiritual needs of Klal Yisrael through being Megalach Chassidus Chabad. What's interesting is, and the Rebbe doesn't mention this in the Fargrengen, but if we think about the Rebbe's Nesius, began with the saying of the Maimer Basi Lagani. I think it's probably the only time that we would find that in the middle of a Maimer, the Rebbe stopped and he began sharing stories of each one of the Rebbeim. Right? Famous stories that the Rebbe says in the Maimer Bas Lagan of each Rebbe. I don't know that that is a common occurrence in any the Rebbe's Mamorim to stop in the middle of a Maimer and share a story. Mishalim we have in Mamorim, but to share a story is, I think, a little bit unique, especially sharing 6 stories. And what's interesting by each one of those stories is that each one of them talk about the Alter Rebbe taking care of the physical needs of the woman who gave birth on Yom Kippur, and the story of the Mittler Rebbe showing physically how he's affected physically by certain physical things that the Chassid was doing, and the Tzemach Tzedek giving a gemach, and the Rebbe Marash traveling, etc., etc. All things to take care of physical needs or doing physical acts. And this was the Rebbe's introduction to the Maimer of leadership, the Maimer that's empowering Dor HaShvi and telling them that we're going to partner together. This is not going to be something that I'm going to be doing on my own. But what is necessary for us to understand? What is the yesod? That if you want to be able to have hashpah on somebody, if you want to be able to have some sort of kiruv hadas, that they should be open and willing to makabel from you, take care of their needs. And when you translate that and bring that down into the leadership of a mechanech or a mechanchos in a classroom or out of the classroom, the word social emotional learning, social emotional needs was mentioned earlier. This is probably an early reference to this idea that if we want for our students to be able to be makabel from us, when they see that for us, their physical needs, their mundane matters that they care about, that are important to them, are valued by us, are respected by us, we care for them, we take care of the Kleinigkeiten, and we're not just focused on meeting goals and feeding information. When they see that we care, that's when they will be open and connected to be able to receive from us as much as it is that we are able to give them the ruchnius in material, in information and in knowledge. But the prerequisite for that is u'meisha hayaraya, is the idea of connecting with them and taking care of their physical needs, their emotional needs, and then they'll be open recipients to what we have to offer them. There's everybody has, I think, their one thought or their one dvar or a story that talks to them, and there's one word from the Rebbe about Parshas Bahaloischa, actually, which to me is one that resonates very deeply, and I like sharing it when I have the opportunity. It's based upon a sikha that's actually not muga. Part of the sikha actually is a mugadik sikha. But in regards to Bahaloischa Saneris, we know that Rashi points out to us that Chol Shadaita Shel Aaron HaKohen felt very bad when he saw the Chanukas Mishkan happening, and he saw that he didn't have a chelik in the Karbanos Anasim. Lo Yehu v'lo Yishiftoi. So the Eibishter says to him, Bahaloischa Saneris, you're going to have this chus to light the menorah in the Mishkan. And he says to him, Chayecha, which means, I swear to you, that Shalcha Gedolah Mishalahem, that your portion is greater than theirs, than the Nesiim. Sha'ata Meitiv U'Madlik Saneris, because you prepare and you kindle the candles of the menorah, the lights of the menorah. So the Rebbe has different questions on the Rashi, but one of the questions the Rebbe asks is, why does Rashi use the uncommon term Chayecha? It means, I swear to you, I promise you, but there are other ways of expressing that. And what the Rebbe says, based upon Chassidus, is that Chassidus teaches us that Aaron HaKohen was told that his job is Bahaloischa Saneris. Your job is to kindle the soul of Neshamas Yisrael. Your job is to be mechanech, and to kindle the souls of your mechunachim. Chol Shadaita Shel Aaron. When Aaron heard this, he felt, Oy Gewalt, how am I going to be able to do this? This is the job you're giving me? To educate? A Yid has Bechira Chavshis. If they want to be able to learn and to grow, they could do it on their own. If they don't want to, how am I going to be able to affect the change? And to this, the Eibishter said to him, Chayecha. If it's negeya to your life, if you treat it as something which is the most important thing in your life, chayecha, and chayecha, you put all of your koiches and chayas into it, you'll be matzliach in kindling those neshamas. And when you do that, shalcha gedolah mishalahem, your portion and your schus is going to be much greater than everything else that the Nesiim were able to bring to the Mishkan. Sure, they brought karbanis, and that was elevating the animals of the world. Sure, they brought flour and oil, being maila, the minat semeach. They might have brought precious stones, which was maila min hadoimim. But atom madlik umetiv zaneris, you're kindling the min hamedaber, you're kindling the precious neshamas of Klal Yisrael. Shalcha gedolim mishalahem, you have the ultimate schus. So we, Mechanchos, have been entrusted with the ultimate job of what the Frierdiker Rebbe put himself into, the chinuch of the next generation, the ultimate of what the Rebbe wants to see, the idea of the Zriya that is going to be something that we're going to see for generations to come. As Mrs. Landau just shared with us, a seed was planted in a classroom in Minnesota 44 years ago, and now it's spread all over the world. The ultimate in Mazare B'chaim, Afu B'chaim. So I'll leave you with one last story. We talk about our lives that we dedicate. Now we have the schus to dedicate to chinuch and to the outcomes that affect those that are mushpa from us. There was a Yid who lived in Crown Heights, and maybe there are some grandchildren of his on tonight's Zoom, I don't know. But he was known by his pen name, Tzvi Yoir, Tzvi Steinmetz, who was a poet. He was a real estate agent, or he dealt with real estate in Crown Heights, but he was also involved he enjoyed poetry, and he would write poetry, be printed in the Kfar Chabad. He had different places that it would be printed. He also had a custom at some point in time that his shul that he would daven in on a regular basis was the shul on the corner of Montgomery and Kingston called Chevra Shas. And he would, after the Fargrengen in the summer times, would go to Chevra Shas for Mincha Ma'ariv, and between Mincha Ma'ariv he would review Chazer sichos that the Rebbe spoke at the Fargrengen that day for Yidden that were not necessarily 100% Chassidei Chabad who daven in Chevra Shas. When it came wintertime and the days got shorter, and especially later years the Fargrengens became longer, he ran into a little bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, he felt a certain responsibility because he would share the Rebbe's Chassidus with those Yidden that daven in Chevra Shas. On the other hand, to get there in time to Mincha Ma'ariv, to Chazer the Fargrengen, he would have to leave the Rebbe's Fargrengen early. So he sat down and he penned a letter to the Rebbe, and he wrote it in a bit of a poetic style, as was his style. He wrote, Nafshi b'she'ei losi. Chaye mi koidmin. He's asking the Rebbe, whose life takes precedence? Chayai, is it my life? Oy chaye elu hatzmeim lishmoya divrei haRebbi, or the life of those who are thirsting to hear the words of the Rebbe. And then he articulated the problem. So the Rebbe's response, and the Rebbe's typical response, the way of responding, was the Rebbe circled the second part, Chaye elu hatzmeim lishmoya divrei haRebbi, but the Rebbe added on top of that 2 words. And those 2 words were, Heim Chayov. You made a distinction, your life, or the life of those that want to hear Torah from the Rebbe. The Rebbe circled those that want to hear Torah from the Rebbe. But the Rebbe pointed out that because you have that opportunity and that schus to be their mashpia, Heim Chayov, they're your life. They're not something that's separate from you. Our Talmidim and Talmidos that we have been entrusted with, that we have the schus to guide and to lead, the Rebbe tells us, are chayecha. This is our life. This is our mandate. This is our schus that we have. And the Rebbe should help that we should tap in to the koiches that our Rabbeim invest in each and every one of us as Mechanchem and Mechanchos, as those that have the schus to care for their precious tzoyin kachim, to connect with our Talmidim and Talmidos, to provide for them their physical, mundane, day-to-day grind that they need, and to listen to their issues, and to care for their things that seem to be kleinigkeiten. But when we do that, we'll be able to connect with them and be able to be mashpia to them, this that they are truly thirsting for, lishmaya divrei haRebbe, lishmaya dvar Hashem, and then we will be zoicha to have those students grow into being a ilon oisei peri and true sources of nachas to us, to themselves, and to our Rabbeim. L'chaim.